Hi there, my name's Dan, and welcome to Lunchtime Literature Accessing the Industry. To begin with, I would like to acknowledge the First Nations and traditional owners of the land from which I'm broadcasting today, which is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, always was and always will be Gadigal land. I also want to extend warmth and solidarity to any First Nations people tuning in today and pay respects to elders past and present and to the elders of the lands wherever this recording might reach. So, welcome to Lunchtime Literature Accessing the Industry. I'm going to be joined by Jinghua Qian, and we're going to chat about all things that are barriers to working class people and people from minoritized backgrounds accessing the literary industry. We're going to introduce ourselves. So, to start with myself, my name's Dan. I grew up in San Remo, which is on Awabakal land on the central coast of so-called New South Wales. I'm a writer slash editor and a publisher at Subdin. In my day job, I work as a casual teacher in the public system in primary schools. And that's a bit about me. I would like to introduce Jinghua Qian, and they can introduce themselves.
Great. Thanks, Dan. So my name's Jinghua Qian. I'll do a little visual description. If you can't see me, I am a non-binary Asian person wearing some clear plastic glasses and an orangey terracotta hoodie. I am coming to you from the land of the Bunurong and Wurundjeri people of Kulin Nation. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present. I've spent most of my life on Kulin Nation's land. I was born in Shanghai and have lived there for a bit, both as a child before coming to Australia and then more recently for a few years working as a journalist there. And I write, I guess, a pretty random range of things. Started out in poetry, and zines and blogs, and then sort of a lot of personal essays, bit of political commentary, bit of journalism, TV. And so now I don't know, I do whatever I want. And I'm a full-time freelancer, which is pretty magical and also pretty hard.
Wonderful. I'm so happy to be joined by you today, Jinghua. I'm a huge fan of your work, especially just the sheer scope and broad range of your work as well. It's super, super interesting. So I thought we'd dive into the conversation, and probably a natural place to start is to, I guess, maybe chat about what are some barriers that working class people face when trying to access the literary industry. I realize that's kind of a loaded question to start with and quite broad, in terms of literary industry. But yeah, what do you? I mean, probably the impetus for me formulating that question was for myself, and my background was you kind of don't know what the barriers are to start with because of your class background and that. So yeah, I'm interested to hear what do you think are some of those barriers.
Yeah, totally. I think the lack of information and transparency is a really big one, especially if you're coming at it thinking like, cool, I'll get a job and it will be like a normal job. And then you're like, wait, there are no jobs. And the work that exists is like, it's not only sort of piecemeal, but there's just so many sort of unspoken rules and sort of weird things that no one tells you and you have no way of knowing, especially in relation to kind of like getting paid and getting, I don't know, like to labor, I guess, that there's not that generally like labor in literature and the arts more broadly isn't in the form of jobs that have like rights and conditions and pay attached to them. It's like all very amorphous and, like would be illegal in pretty much any other industry. So it's like, especially if you've got a job doing something else and then you're like, oh, okay, so there's like no deadline for you to pay me. Like you can just take 3 months and there's like, very little I can do about it. And I'm somehow set up as a business when I'm like, whoever you are. when you're really like in more of an employment relationship. So I think that stuff, the kind of like mystery around that,
Yeah.
I would say is like one of the big barriers for me. Yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, and yeah, I can totally reflect what you're saying there. I think it is, excuse me, it is the mystery. So my family background, my parents and their parents come from quite working class jobs. They were factory workers, manual laborers, garbage men, things of that nature. So quite lowly paid, but quite unionized jobs.
Mhm.
Um, and then I came along as a little nerd who wanted to pursue writing, and that. And yeah, so you sort of default to your parents and your community around you and go, oh, so how do you make it that way? And obviously they didn't know, um, which creates that mystery because there's no one in your community to go to. Oh, hey, I want to be a writer of this description. What's the pathway? And no one really knows. And then as I got older and sort of careened into it, navigating it myself through trial and error, it was always interesting to reflect on that. And my family and community as well, always quite surprised, I think, by the fact, and in ways that you've just described as well, like how just this complete almost lack of workers' rights compared to um, historical jobs that they have worked in themselves. They're surprised that in
Mhm.
something um, such as writing, which from their viewpoint is seen as a sort of more, I guess, bougie sort of pathway. They're like, oh, what do you mean?
Totally.
What do you mean they can just pay you whenever or not at all? Or what do you mean they only pay you that? What?
Yeah.
So it's like these layers and layers of mystery which sort of have unraveled over time. And I can see why a lot of working class writers, they start out and then they sort of just give up as well. Um, yeah. So how have you managed to navigate that? I'm interested over time, or key things that, or aha moments when you're like, oh, that's how you navigate this, and you can continue at it and sort of um, build on that initial aspiration.
Yeah, I think I mean I was writing and kind of making stuff kind of as a teenager and as a student and then alongside like different day jobs for probably like quite a while, I guess, before really trying to um like make a living from it, or that wasn't really possible. And so for a long time I just worked like 3 or 4 day a week jobs that were sometimes vaguely like, in like comms or something,
Yeah.
but often, yeah, often not as well. Like I was in a call center for 5 years. Um, but um and then, doing my own writing and occasionally getting paid for it, but knowing that it wouldn't really be sustainable. And then eventually got a writing job as a journalist, and then have had like a couple of other jobs since then, and then went full-time freelance um, during the pandemic when it was possible to get, the doll with the coronavirus supplement, which is like, I just tell everyone that's like basically how I managed to
Yeah.
survive, is that I had that uh year of being able to like build um like a freelance career into something kind of sustainable while having job seeker at like a more livable rate.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so it's been pretty slow. It's been,
Yeah.
I don't know, like more than 15 years, I guess,
Yeah.
to get it to this point where I am like able to support myself on freelancing. Probably, I'm not sure what the breakdown is of like writing, editing, workshops, events, transcription, like the different
Yeah.
kinds of work that I do, and it's changed a lot year to year. So this year it's probably like a bit more um, teaching and television income, and then like less writing and editing, and
Yeah.
less from like literary work. Um, but yeah, so I guess I'm always like kind of managing that mix, and it is, um, I guess, yeah, I have started to like think of it as a business, which is something that you are sort of forced into via like, you have to kind of like get an ABN and like
Yeah.
get yeah, set yourself up as a business. And I think that sometimes I'm sort of resistant to thinking of it that way, because
Yeah.
I think that's it's sort of not really the like how I would see the kind of work that I do. But then sometimes that is useful, and I think kind of being a bit more shameless about like I actually need to like feed myself and house
Yeah.
myself, and
Yeah.
and not just like be doing this for fun. And I think that's given me like better boundaries around work, and also made me a little stronger in negotiating with publications and with organizations. Yeah, and also like I've got a lot more active in the union over the last few years, and that's really helped, I think, to be like, okay, both for that, for demystifying, some of those unspoken things, but also like actually trying to organize and shift the needle on them. Yeah.
Yeah.
Tell me about your trajectory.
Yeah, so my trajectory is I don't live off writing full time, but there's a little I can relate to some overlap there in the context of COVID and job seeker and that. So I work as a teacher, but I work as a casual teacher, and partly how I've been able to do do that and live is because I balance it with freelance work. But interestingly, the way that I was able to sort of suddenly jump up and do that was because during I think it was 2020 when COVID first struck. Government allowed us to access our super, so I drew down on some super, and that sort of has been the base where I've been able to fill in the holes here and there to work less in my day job as a casual teacher, and then fill that in with producing writing work. The type of writing work I do generally doesn't pay well at all. I mean, no writing work really pays well at all, but certainly poetry doesn't.
Yeah.
And sometimes I write nonfiction, like polemic or creative nonfiction, usually writing about teaching and industrial relation matters as well, which has been kind of what's the word, inadvertent stream of income. So I work my day job where the working conditions are bad, and then I write about it, and that's also a stream of income. So that is what it is. But yeah, I've been doing it for similar time as you, about 15 years, and it really has taken that long to get to even that point, which I think is an interesting one about because a lot of opportunities I find in the literary industry, very broadly speaking, from poetry to journalism to whatever, there's a lot of opportunities are sort of, how do I put this? They're trapped under like an age barrier. So it's like, for a lot of prizes, for example, are 30 and under, or 35 and under, or this or that or the other. But for a conversation I always come back to with my comrades, I guess you say, is they're always like, but it takes working class writers a lot longer to get there, to hone their craft, even to be really good at something. It might take 15 years. It might take them from the age of 20 to 35 or older. But then suddenly all these opportunities have moved beyond them because you had to be really good at it when you were 25, which was an impossibility because you had to support yourself by other unrelated means at the same time as trying to get good at what you're doing and find yourself and voice through your writing that way.
Yeah, absolutely. So many youth opportunities are like kind of built on the assumption that you are being supported by your parents, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I have to say though, I think turning 35 was like, it was kind of a relief to be like, oh, I'm not eligible for all that shit. I can just, give up on it now. It's nice to move on and be like, okay, it's close to me.
Yeah, it is strangely liberating. I turned 35 in a few weeks, which means I've aged out of like the Vogel and some other stuff. And I was just like, okay, good, probably, actually. I don't know. Okay.
I don't know.
It's funny, once it comes, you're sort of not too bothered by it. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a funny one.
I was like, cool, I'm 35. I haven't written the great Australian novel. I haven't like, won any youth prizes. I'm solid. Like, this
Yeah,
is just my life. Yeah. I
yeah,
don't know. It's sort of nice to, um, yeah, to be able to put that to the side. I think, I don't know.
definitely.
I find like that kind of, the part of the sector that's like opportunities really stressful, and I don't really relate to it very well. Like, grants
Yeah,
and prizes and fellowships and residencies, like all of that. I don't know. I feel like I'm much happier just like pitching than kind of feeling like I'm being judged rather than the idea.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
That's a. I really like how you put that actually, because I've applied for a lot of fellowships and grants, and I've had, compared to what I've applied for, I've had, I guess, little success. But I got the next fellowship scheme a few years ago, and that was huge. So that was a really big thing for me to get. You don't have to get everything, but it does require, I think, and I get why how you feel about it, because it feels like you're just constantly applying and applying for stuff, and it gets to a point where you're like, I could just spend this time writing, and that might
Mhm.
actually turn into something rather than spending hours and hours on grant applications that seem to always, you know, come back not in not in your favor, um, which probably isn't very practical advice. But I think there's something to be said of, if I was to couch anything in sort of an advice realm, would be just to, and I guess it's cliche too, but to stick at it and not give up, because eventually, and not be put off by that, but also the age stuff as well, because ultimately it doesn't really matter, and there's not actually that many opportunities as well. Um, I'm interested to pick your brain a bit about pitching, though. Actually, what's your sort of, I guess, day to day or week to week? What does pitching look like for you?
Yeah, I've gone through sort of phases. At the moment, I don't pitch a lot because I get like a decent number of commissions or sort of like ongoing work. So often when I am pitching, it's to editors I've already worked with and publications that, I write for like semi regularly.
Yep.
So it's not going in cold. But there have been times where, yeah, I was sending like 20 pitches a month, more even. Yeah, so I guess there's no like magic trick. And I think the really important thing is to like not take rejection personally. And,
Yeah.
and especially if you have been on the other side as an editor, you kind of understand that there's like so many different things that go into editorial judgment that are not about the writer and the quality of their work. Like, there's so much that's around sort of timeliness and getting like an appropriate variety, whether that's like literary variety or sort of topical in like a more journalistic sense. There's the timeliness, there's like format, there's like how much editorial labor is available. There's like legal aspects, of like the amount of risk a publication is willing to take. So there's a lot happening kind of on the editor and commissioning side that's kind of not a judgment of you or
Yep.
your skill. But I think like for pitching, I guess what works for me is like really trying to understand what that publication is trying to do, where they sit in the broader landscape and like how, like what you can offer that speaks directly to that. Um, so I guess I try and think of it, even if it is um, literary work where it's not so much maybe like service or information oriented compared to journalism, but even for a literary publication, I guess I try and balance like the newness and the familiarity. Like, so new in the sense of you're not replicating something they've just published, but familiar enough that it's like, okay, you understand, yeah, where that publication sits in the literary landscape and the like their particular value and niche, and sort of try and speak to that. So I guess that's how I think of a pitch. And my pitches tend to be really short. I know sometimes people write like really
Mm,
long multi-paragraph pitches. Mine are usually like a few sentences, maybe two paragraphs, but yeah, it's really just like the idea, why it matters, and a little bit about me. I try and pull up, which obviously early in your career you won't have like a lot of like much of a portfolio, but you can send either other work you've done, even if it hasn't been published, or you can link to, like a blog or something. But yeah, I usually will send a couple of things that I've had published that are related. And often it's like I'll send something that's related thematically and something that's related stylistically, so that hopefully the editor can kind of like triangulate from that into like what, I'd be able to do. And I guess also the other really important thing is that like the pitch is a plan as well. It's not just an idea, it's a story and like a way to action it. Yeah, so just keeping it kind of practical, like who would you talk to, how would you do the research, or
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. I'm always curious to hear about how people pitch, because I have some experience with pitching as well and varied success in that. And interestingly, my pitches tend to be quite short as well. So I always try to keep them quite short and to the point. And also in the sort of things that I generally pitch, I try to sort of put in a concise way, why they would be newsworthy. Newsworthy in scare quotes there. Because often it can be time sensitive. I think sometimes it's important to state if something is time sensitive, as long as it actually is. But maybe let's move on from pitching. I've got a whole bunch of questions here that we're sort of going through from different angles. We did make a point here about possibly chatting about the unpaid intern industrial complex. I don't know how in detail we can get with that. I've never done an internship, but I have plenty of opinions on them. Did you want to speak to that in any way?
Yeah, I've only done one internship, and it was more than 10 years ago. It was with Express Media, and it was a good experience. But I wouldn't say that it sort of like very directly led to any opportunities for me. I think it was useful to kind of see how an organization like that operates, and so I found it valuable in that regard. It wasn't like a lot of time, so it was maybe a day a week for however long. I think I think it's useful with any opportunity. It's useful to like know what you're trying to get out of it, rather than just be like, oh, now I'm just working for free. But that was unpaid, and it was for I'm not sure how long now. Maybe even no, I can't say.
That's all right.
Yeah.
Well, I guess I sort of have done an internship of sorts. I was on EdCom for VoiceWorks more than a decade ago as well, which isn't called an internship, but it is sort of like one. Which I speak very highly of. It was unpaid, but very low hours and that, but I got a lot out of it. And it's always that thing with internships, isn't it? But I think you went straight to the heart of it there. Before you even apply, be very clear about what you want to get out of it. Does the description of the internship you're applying for, is it clear about what it is? And I think anything Express Media does is it's always quite clear, and has been for a long time, what is expected, what you could get out of it. If it's an internship somewhere else that's kind of vague, I would be, alarm bells would go off.
And I think also you don't need to do a million of them. Sometimes I think people just keep taking unpaid opportunities, which and I think focusing your any unpaid labor, I mean, everyone has their own kind of internal flowchart of when you work for free and why. And I think if it's something you that is both really important to you, gives you some creative control often, and wouldn't be possible to get paid for, then that's pretty worthwhile, especially if you're actually making something creatively that is yours, in a sense, and you can kind of develop your craft through it. But sometimes I feel you can get kind of just trapped in the loop of doing lots of unpaid positions, and if that's actually becoming like a drain on your life and your time, and it's taking away from your own creative work, then yeah, it's probably not that useful.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I sometimes reflect on it in comparison to teaching. So when you do a teaching degree, you do placement. I sort of think of internships when they're good and done well as a placement. So you only do one or two of them within quite a specific context, and then you move on and off you go. But yeah, like you said, if you keep doing them again and again and again, they're not really professional development opportunities or placements in a way. It's sort of, yeah, I think it just needs to be structured and guided.
Yeah, I do wish that like publications and organizations were more transparent, like externally about those processes, because like, for instance, like I know that, for instance, as a writer, if I am contributing to a publication and the editor that I'm dealing with is not paid, like I would actually like to know that, because I will be a lot more flexible and, you know, patient with their time if I know that they're not paid. And often you don't, and then you're like, why is this person, you know, like not replying or whatever it is. But yeah, I think that, like, you know, because there's just sort of a little more transparency across like all of those things would be so useful.
Yeah, absolutely. It's and that's a funny thing I've come to learn over the last decade, is that even if I am being paid for my labor as a writer, and I think people from the outside, like my family, for example, would be surprised to hear I'm getting paid to write this thing, but the person who's editing and publishing it is often not. It's
Yeah,
sort of
like that
what is
seems
that?
absolutely outrageous, right? And
Yeah.
that's often the case, and it's just something you would not know without being in the industry. And like you said before, like I think the perception that like writing and literature and sort of culture industries are like white collar jobs, you know, like people assume that they're actually, that, you know, people are like professionals getting paid like professional rates, and then you're like, no, it's like people who are independently wealthy volunteering mostly.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think it's a real shame, speaking to that structure we just mentioned there, is because often as a writer, you don't just sit around writing your poetry all day and, you know, wads of cash come in. Often it is you work out also as an editor or a publisher or both, or this or that, or teaching. But yeah, it's a shame that there's sort of no real structural consistency, which can be quite off-putting, I think, if you come from a working class or minoritized background. You look at that and go, hang on, so I can get paid to write the thing, but if I want to like do this full time, so, you know, go into sort of editing and writing, etc., I may or may not be paid. Like it's this really sort of unbalanced ecosystem, or industry, as it's often called.
And it varies in really weird ways that, you know, I didn't know until, you know, the last, I don't know, 5 years or so, that where, for instance, like communications jobs, like media and communications and public relations, like pay like quite a lot often.
Yeah.
And then like journalism sort of really varies like wildly. And then like literature pays like practically nothing. And sometimes it's like very similar kinds of work. And you're just like, why? And there is money, you know, in literature and literary publishing, like publishers make money. It's just like for some reason, well, for a lot of reasons that we can go into, a lot of reasons that have been analyzed or that you can read about, but it doesn't, the money that goes into the industry doesn't go to labor.
The people who produce the value certainly don't, you know, receive the extent of the value to which they produce, you know, trickle down economics, etc. Which maybe this is a good point to talk about burnout. What can burnout look like, and how might one navigate burnout? I guess you've been doing it for a while. I have as well. I'd be keen to hear how you navigate that.
Yeah, I think I've definitely, one thing that's helped is like, because I work in quite different ways and sort of worlds, when I feel exhausted or like traumatized by one thing, I can kind of go to another that is quite different. And I feel like my kind of like arts and literature work and my like more journalism and media worlds are quite separate. So that can kind of help to tap out of one thing and sort of move to another. I think in terms of burnout, just like having boundaries, around not just like sort of time and money and and kind of like trying to make your life like as sustainable as you can that way, but also around like how much of yourself you put into things, I think is important, especially for writers from marginalized backgrounds early in their career. I think there can be a lot of pressure to be like extremely vulnerable and open and personal and expose kind of a lot of yourself in your work. And I think I have sometimes done that, and then sometimes and like sometimes been really grateful for the opportunity to do that. And it's a kind of thinking that I enjoy, and I do enjoy writing things that are like quite personal and sort of intimate and emotional. But then yeah, that is often the kind of thing that I need breaks from or need boundaries around. And also boundaries around like I think social media and being available and having like your personality online, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, and being able to like sometimes I think step back into something like more anonymous or more professional, and yeah, that is useful to me. Yeah, how about for you?
Yeah, not completely dissimilar actually. It's probably how I've ended up writing poetry and journalistic stuff, and then creative, weird nonfiction as well. When I get sick of one, and probably by sick of I mean sort of burnt out with it, it's like it's nice to have something else to preoccupy me, so that I don't fall into nihilistic territory of giving up or whatever, or spiraling
Mm,
or whatever. Social media is another, I think, another layer that adds to, in my experience, to burnout. And probably previously I didn't realize it at the time, but I've come to realize over time that it does, sort of, it can really, what's the word, like, impact burnout
mm,
that's already there. I mean, because social media, I know it is what it is. You're ingesting so much like high emotion every single day, whether it's just the news or something that's extremely hilarious or whatever.
mm,
It's full on. It's full on, and if you're already in that place
yeah.
because of your work, um, it can only exacerbate it, or does for me anyway. So yeah, I think taking time out from social media has been and it is I've found it surprisingly hard for someone who doesn't have much of a strong opinion about social media these days. I find myself find it difficult to untether myself from it, but I always find it beneficial when I do. Um, we do have some questions coming in actually in the live chat. So I was wondering maybe we can maybe because I was keen to talk about this too, sort of around negotiating and unionism and things like that. We have a question that's about negotiating. For example, in the question, it says, could we speak about negotiating, for example, in a book contract context? Yeah, personally, I don't have any experience in negotiating a book contract, so I probably can't speak to that in a in an advice sort of way. I can only sort of regurgitate things that I've heard on the grapevine. Um,
Yeah, I
but
don't either. I don't have
yeah,
any. I've never signed a book contract, but yeah, do you just general advice maybe?
yeah, maybe general advice, because I think it's um, there's a lot that can be said probably quite broadly. Like for Mia, for example, what is Mia? I think that's a good starting point. Who do they cover in their membership base and so on?
Yeah, sure. So, ME is the Media, Entertainment and Arts Alliance, so it's the union for the sector. Um, and they're probably like who I would go to for negotiating more what I do, which is like both sort of commissions and in writing, as well as like sometimes stuff that's paid, by the day or by the hour, events, speaking kind of, and workshops, all of that. But in terms of negotiating, like in general as a principle, I would say, like, yeah, you start with kind of trying to figure out what the status quo or what the sphere is that you're in, whether that's like talking to other writers, you know, in a like through formal organizations like the union, or organizations like Australian Society of Authors, or you know, these industry bodies, or just like a casual writers group, or like personal connections that you've made, getting a sense of the scope of, you know, what's possible. And you can also find out a lot of this through research. So for a book contract, for instance, like, you know, there's like a fair bit that authors have like posted publicly. It varies a lot from the US to here, but I think like it's useful to have a sense of what someone doing something similar might have been able to get, and just so you're not starting from something like totally wild. I think one thing that Mia has that's useful is a rate tracker. So for pieces, people like we can put the link in the on the thing maybe, but people anonymously like report the rates that they've been paid. So you can kind of see like, oh, okay, there are actually publications, you know, paying $1 per word, for instance, for this kind of writing. And then you can, you know, maybe use that, as well as, I guess, just connecting to like wherever you can at the moment, where freelancers for a bunch of different publications and media outlets are sort of organizing. So I'm like quite involved in the Guardian campaign. But the same thing is happening with like Nine, which is like Age, Sydney Morning Herald, etc. And so like making those connections, you can kind of see like, oh, where's maybe like the wiggle room. So that's useful. And I think another thing that's really useful for pieces, not for books, but the freelance charter is really useful for thinking about like, what are all the different conditions I could maybe get, and so things like kill fees, or you know, what kind of copyright can I like negotiate. So that's like, I refer to that a lot.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that wealth of information. When you were speaking, I was madly typing in Australian Society of Authors. Because again, I don't know too much about publishing contracts in the context of books, but my first thought was look at the ASA's website. So if you Google Australian Society of Authors, there's so much information on there. All kinds of, they do support, advice, advocacy, all kinds of things. So if you have any questions about that, that would be my starting point, for sure. Looks like we have a few other questions coming in, so I might have a look at some of those. One question is about, have either of you had experience in self-publishing? I do, but I don't. So I run a very, very small publisher called Subbed In, and it's not self-publishing, but we do use a printer that is historically and still gets used quite a lot by self-publishers traditionally. But I guess I don't know. I'm not sure if that's really a question other than that. I think in terms of self-publishing things, the opportunities for that have got a lot more interesting in recent times, is probably the way to put it. Like we saw Michael Winkler's Grimish on the Miles Franklin this year. If I had, I don't know, and this is just my opinion, it's not advice, but I would always, if it was me, want to exhaust a list of publishers first, and then sort of do self-publishing as a last resort. But there's people who like to do it from the get-go as well. Let's have another look through the questions here. This is an interesting one about burnout. Do either of you build in structured time for hardcore rest, i.e. breaks that are not switching from one job to another? How do you approach break/rest when you manage your own workload?
That's such a good question. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like, I'm like, being your own boss, you have to be like, "Oh, I'm actually the worst boss." Like,
Yeah,
I'm worst.
yeah,
I
can
exploit
relate.
myself more than, like, other people do. Yeah, and, like, learning to be like, "Oh, I need to, like, give myself leave and give myself weekends and
Yeah,
sick leave and all of that." I think
yeah,
I've done that a lot better this year, like 2022, because I feel like 2020, I was, like, really hustling to just, I don't know, like build a career. And then last year I was like really focused on kind of consolidating it into a few things that were more regular and that I could count on, and not having to like, pitch to 40 publications in a month. And then this year I've kind of like really tried to go easy on myself. So I've like really maintained like um yeah, proper breaks, and taken like given myself sick leave, and
yeah,
that, and not tried to like not freak out about, not making money because I'm not paid when I'm sick. But yeah, and taking like holidays and stuff. So I don't know, it's really hard to do though when you're like, especially when you're in that um mindset, which isn't like paranoid at all, like where you really just feel like, oh, if I don't say yes to this, like it will never, like they will never ask again. Um, so yeah, I think just like learning to say no is both, there's a, like the psychological thing and the sort of social thing, but also like practically, I think like I did have to build things to a point of feeling like a little bit more stable before I could say no to work and not like completely freak out about it. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. It's really hard, especially because we sort of exist in this productivity culture where it's sort of like endless. It feels like you've got to be endlessly hustling to get anywhere. Um, but something I've learned, yeah, the hard way is to try and take that break, whatever it looks like, even if it's a day, before I get burnt out. And just for me personally, trying to pick up on those signals of like, oh, hang on a sec, you're burning the candle at both ends here. Maybe take a day. Yeah, you're not going to get paid, but it's worth it, because then if I fully burn out, then it's a bigger problem for myself personally down the track. But yeah, I think actually probably the hardest thing is, sort of taking your foot off the pedal, even if things are going all right, but you can feel yourself going down that track. That can be quite hard, but the payoff I think is much bigger than sort of working yourself into a corner, and then you have to
Mm.
take more time off. Um, yeah, something I've tried to do more recently this year is to in the way that I structure my time is to give myself, yeah, a weekend, as Jinghua pointed out as well. Like a day, at least a day a week where I'm not working on anything, just doing
Yeah.
whatever. um, which can sometimes be hard. It doesn't always go that way, but at least having that as an aim week to week, I think is good. Yeah, and being more forgiving of myself too. I think this hustle culture we live in too, sort of, if you don't hit certain self-imposed goals, that somehow you have to punish yourself existentially if you don't hit those marks. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
And also I think having, this is different from like a break in time, but I think it's also useful to have um things in your life that don't feed into your work and that are kind of like
yeah,
protected from work. Like
yeah,
I
yeah,
try and be like, okay, I'm gonna write about everything, like, and I'm
yeah,
not gonna try and like mine every part of my life for writing.
yeah,
And I think especially when I've been doing a little bit less criticism, but I really enjoy doing criticism. I think it's been useful for me to be like, I'm not gonna write about music, and
yeah,
then when I'm listening to music, I'm not gonna think about like how I can write
yeah,
about this. I can, that can just be like a thing that is for me. And I'm quite protective of that now. Like I just don't want to have the way that I read or the way that I watch film and TV to um I don't want to access music that way, I guess. Like I kind of like, I don't know, cotton wooling it in this like different relationship that is like a bit more, I don't know, sensual and just uh like pure pleasure, I guess.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a really good one actually, and something I've tried to do specifically in reading as well, especially reading books. because every time I'm reading something, I'm like, oh, how did the author do this? How can I learn from what they've done here to achieve this effect, impact, etc. So I've been trying to read more for the love of reading rather than from
Mm.
the perspective of a writer, which is quite hard to divorce on purpose because your brain naturally goes there. But yeah, that's something to think about and something that I'm working towards. It'd be nice to pick up a book and not think about how the author wrote it and just read it.
Yeah. Yeah.
um, all right, questions. There's another one here which is interesting about reputation within the industry. How do you build a reputation within the industry? Is it mostly approaching various publications case by case until you build a portfolio and contacts over a period of time?
Yeah, I would say that's basically it.
Yeah.
But do you want to talk about that first, Dan, and then I'll
Yeah, sure. How do you build a reputation? Yeah, definitely. It's sort in a word, the answer is yes, but it might not go in the direction that you expect it to from the outset. And the reason I say that is because publications themselves, especially in even just the last 5 years, seem to be evolving quite rapidly and changing their own MO or the shift. There seems to be, maybe it's just my own, and maybe I'm projecting here. There seems to be publications seem a little bit confused about who their target audience is or who their base audience is, and you see it across the board, whether it's if we're talking about journalism, whether it's ABC, Crikey, Guardian, whatever. There's some confusion, some more than others, about who they're trying to speak to. So my bigger point is that build up your portfolio. That will build up your reputation. But what's more important is that what your values are. Your portfolio, in that respect, your body of work should reflect where you want to go as a writer, and not where publications feel they want to
Yes.
take their masthead. And you see it all the time. You see it all the time where a journalist, for however long, you're like, yeah, they're great, love their work, and then suddenly they're working in a different publication, and you're shocked by the things they're writing. Like, what? Huh? Is this even the same person? What happened here? Yeah, that's my hot take.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. Like, don't build the reputation you want to have, not what someone's trying to like shoehorn you into, or what's like useful, especially for writers with like different marginalized identities and communities. Like, have like a really strong sense of yourself and what your values are, and which communities you want to be accountable to, that aren't like getting sucked into the, I guess, machine of like diversity flavor of the month, and what a publication might need, that can often be like both personally damaging to you, damaging to your creativity, and I think like damaging to your community politically. So I think like, I don't know, I mean, so much of this is like learning when to say no, and also like actually creating opportunities yourself, and not just like responding to what exists. But I think for me, I guess another thing with like building a reputation is I feel like I've kind of both like slowly built my niche, I guess, on like where I sit and what I do and what people might like reach out to me for, but also like sort of like discarded things, over the course of my practice as well. And also it's been like, I changed my name about 7 years ago. So I went back to my birth name, so I think, and I think for a lot of trans writers, that's like interesting, because in some ways you lose. I'd also like been overseas, so I kind of lost a lot of my like reputation and connections and contacts, because I came back to Australia and like no one knew who I was, which was kind of great actually. Like, it was hard, but it was also kind of good to sort of have a fresh start in some ways. I guess it is about building that body of work, as Dan said, and building your skills as well, your skills and craft, in the way that you want, um, and and delivering like, yeah, not. I guess it's important. I think to like not just treat building a portfolio as like collecting bylines, and actually try and be like, okay, every piece in there, like I did for a reason. Like this is either this was a topic I really wanted to explore, or this is something that like I made my own and interesting in whatever way, um, rather than just a resume, I suppose. I think I don't know.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I try and I guess figure out like what is important and valuable to me in that process.
It just made me think of something. This is quite a specific, practical question, and I love talking to other writers about this. Website, author websites. You've got one. I've got one. Are they actually useful? Or is it sort of like writing itself? Especially if it's in print, you're like, I don't know who's reading this. Is it a lot of people? Is it some? Is it no one? You know, is there? My question is there a utility in someone? Because obviously, when we talk about a body of work or a portfolio, usually we're talking about a website. Yeah, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, I mean, a lot of people reach out to me via, if not my website, like they read
Mm.
something, then they click through, they were able to see like the range of what I do, and then they contact me. So I think it's been really useful for me. And also like having, I guess, more control over that than if it's just left up to like the Google algorithm.
Yeah,
Because like actually, if you search me, like the things that come up are really random and they're not necessarily like the pieces of work that I'm most proud of. So I
yeah,
think like
yeah,
useful to at least have, and also, yeah, like I guess as trans people and as whatever, like having some way to project your own sense of yourself into the universe, and not Google's or not like bylines you've had before,
mhm,
or ways other people have described you is valuable to me. But I think like with both having an author website and social media in general, and an online presence, like yeah, I would only like invest as much effort and energy into it as is kind of fun for you and interesting and like
yeah,
feels, because it's like, yeah, it's not directly going to be like if you're spending hours maintaining all of that stuff, it's not like directly um going to get you work.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It existing won't necessarily procure
Yeah.
um, those work opportunities. Yeah, I find it even just from a personal standpoint, it's kind of nice to be able to curate, or just look at. Oh, okay, that's what I've done over this period of time. Um, yeah, um, but yeah, you are right though. It's sort of it's not the be all and and end all for sure. Um, Yeah, I've got work through the website as well. I've also got weird emails through the website as well, um, which is something to be aware of, I guess.
Mm.
Um, all
I
right,
guess
some
for contact from readers as well, which yeah is like sometimes useful, sometimes abusive, sometimes really
yeah,
valuable. Like
yeah,
it
yeah,
if you're available, you're gonna get all of the above, I guess. But I get
yeah,
um some of the best feedback I've got has, yeah, I think this the stuff I do kind of more around history and nonfiction like tends to get like more like meaningful engagement. But that's been really cool because so my friend
mm,
Liz and I do this like project called Underfoot, which is like a local history thing, and I've had like so many people write in to just like tell me their stories of like, you know, being like a lesbian hanging around Footscray Park in the 80s, or like, oh, I used to work at like this mill in the 60s and this factory. And, I remember when this thing happened. And that's been really amazing. So I've really appreciated that. Just like lots of local figures, yeah, writing in with their own stories. Yeah.
yeah. No, it's really cool. I love talking about the internet when it's not social media. Usually,
Yeah.
that's like you know and that can be good and bad in its own. But it's interesting to talk about, I guess, people coming together outside of social media, but on the internet. Um, yeah. There's a follow up question here. It says, also, what do you think it takes to be a great writer? And I realize we've only got like 5 minutes left. Um, that's a fairly loaded question.
Mm.
But
I have to say, I don't think about that at all.
yeah,
Like,
yeah.
I don't think I have a sense of like what a great writer is. I just have like people I like to read, and there's people I like to read for different things, or some people where I might, I really love their short stories, but I don't love, their work in another genre, or something like that. So I don't know that I think of writers as great.
Yeah, no, yeah, I definitely reflect that as well, I think. And I think that's, we sort of, to talk about it from a cultural standpoint, I'm a bit wary of, things having to be the best or place number one, et cetera, et cetera. I'm more interested in, you know, I guess the experience of being in the presence of that work or reading that
Mm.
work or what that work makes possible in the world that wasn't possible before, in small ways, big ways, or even if it's just a conversation I had with someone
Mm.
about anything related. So yeah, I don't
Yeah,
think,
and I
yeah,
think it's also like about thinking about, your orientation, like what are you oriented towards? And sometimes, like I'm more interested in what like storytelling that is for like a really specific community, like I don't know, people who live in Footscray or whatever it is, or
yeah,
I'm not necessarily trying to speak to like Australian literature or
yeah,
something like much broader, or something that would kind of um be great in that sense of having like a really lasting legacy on a broad audience. I don't know, I think,
yeah,
I have like a real appreciation for things that are for like niche communities and that are
yeah.
like hyper local, or that are maybe exactly like what someone needs to read in a particular moment, but like won't always resonate forever. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I think if we're going to talk about what makes a great writer, it's definitely, I think, being specific in intention. I think is, if you can apply the word great, I think that's where it would fall. Let's have a look if there's any more questions. Oh yeah, there is. And we've only got 2 minutes, so there's one about submitting work to Subdin for the first time. Okay, so I might just speak to this quickly. So Subdin is open for poetry manuscript submissions at the moment. Any advice? I probably don't have anything really that people haven't said before in terms of um, submitting a poetry manuscript. I think the most interesting thing to me as a reader and as a publisher of poetry is manuscripts that are very cohesive and have sort of a through line thematically, and read more as a cohesive work that way rather than a collection of sort of disparate poems sort of lumped together. So yeah, one thing I would um, I guess suggest is that if you have a manuscript length work of poetry, is to look at it and maybe even go through a diligent rewriting process of looking how you can make it standalone as a book rather than as here's a bunch of poems in one place. And there is one more question. Do you think it's necessary to have a presence on social media in order to build that reputation and make it in the industry? I know we're quickly running out of time. We've sort of spoken to this. Do you think, Jinghua, that it is like mandatory? It's compulsory. You're never going to make it if you don't have a Twitter or Instagram or whatever.
I think absolutely not, but I think at least having like an email address so people can contact you if they want to like commission you, like you probably want to start with at least that.
Yeah.
You can kind of be accessible to I guess organizations and publications without being like personally available, just by having like literally a landing page with an email on it, or you can also have like a portfolio through like Muckrack or something like that that has that but is like quite anonymous.
Yeah. And I would totally just second that as well. When I'm on the other side of things, editing, publishing, organizing events, etc. When I am really interested in someone's work and I want to contact them, especially for an event, if they're not on social media, but they also don't have a website with a landing page email address, it becomes quite difficult. So I think, yeah, you don't need to be on social media, but yeah, have, as Jinghua said, at least a landing page with some contact details goes a long way. Yeah. All right. Well, I think that brings us to the end of the event. Yeah. Thanks so much for chatting with me today, Jinghua.
Thank you. Really lovely conversation to have with all of you.
Lovely. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Cheers. See
All the
ya.
best. Cheers. Bye.